Ah! The gods are angry! We're all doomed!
The topic is the afterlife is likely. Let me begin. There are a few definitions that I have to get out of the way before I start, and they are: your consciousness is defined as the set of your subjective experiences. An event is defined as two states of affairs with the whole thing encompassed as one event. The event your consciousness ceasing to be is state 1, your consciousness exists, and state 2, your consciousness doesn't exist. An event is impossible to imagine happening if, and only if, the second state in the event is impossible to imagine. To show that something is impossible to imagine, it does not just suffice to merely assert it, as merely asserting that something is impossible to imagine does not make it so. The argument is a cogent inductive argument, which means that the conclusion is more likely true rather than not, which is what I'm trying to show in the debate. An inductive argument is cogent if the major premise has a great many true cases, is falsifiable, and has never been shown false in any instance. My argument fits these qualifications. Here it is. If an event is impossible to directly imagine happening, then it is impossible to happen. It is impossible to directly imagine your consciousness ceasing to exist, therefore it is impossible for your consciousness to cease to exist. The first premise is true in all cases of contradictions to the laws of logic. Logical contradictions cannot exist anywhere, including your imagination.
This is Npage85's extremely silly argument for the afterlife, and in extension God. The only thing this argument is good for is to diminish my respect for philosophy, if this could under any circumstance be considered good philosophy. I can think of numerous objections to this argument, so let's begin. According to the argument, coming into existence and being unconscious would be impossible. The first premise relies on imagination, which just makes the entire argument nonsense, or in the words of my 5-year-old niece, imagination is what is not real. The notion that reality in any way would be dependent on imagination is complete nonsense. What is imagination? Well, it is an approximation of reality. Imagination can never provide us with an accurate description of reality, due to the fact that imagination, while being limitless, is still dependent on our extremely limited ability to interpret reality. For example, our senses are limited to a very small aspect of reality, i.e., the tiny amount of the electromagnetic spectra, visible light, our eyes can detect. Then our sensory input is also interpreted and manipulated by our cognitive functions before they are presented to our consciousness. So when we imagine things, we approximate an approximation of reality, and to draw a conclusion about reality from that, well, only an idiot would do that. Let's take a hydrogen atom. It consists of a proton nucleus with an electron in an orbital mathematical wave function around the nucleus. It is impossible to imagine how the electron moves in the orbital, because we don't know. From the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, we know that there is a fundamental limitation to just how precisely we can know both the position and the momentum of a particle at a given time. So when we imagine the concept of the electron moment in a hydrogen atom, it will be a very flawed approximation, and it is impossible to directly imagine how an electron moves from one orbital to another, for example from an s orbital to a d orbital, which shows your premise to be false. So your premise will be shown false unless you resort to saying that the event, electron moving from state 1 to state 2, does not need to be an accurate description of reality, and then if an approximation is sufficient, then, well, it is not impossible to approximate what ceasing to exist would be like. Now, what is consciousness? Well, you have decided to make your very own definition, subjective experience. What is subjective experience then? Well, this is the central nervous system of a human. We can roughly compartmentalize it into 4 categories: sensory input, memory, cognitive functions, and personality. Subjective experience is what each individual experiences from these 4 categories, and each experience must be unique, because even identical twins do not share the exact 100% DNA sequence. But much more importantly, they do not share the exact same sensory input, memory, cognitive functions, and personality. All 4 categories are purely physical. They can be manipulated with chemicals, and damages to the central nervous system will cause changes in all four categories. Any rational person will also conclude that since all four categories can be manipulated and the resulting subjective experience will change. For example, ask a doped up hippie what the color red tastes like. That subjective experiences are in fact physical and a direct consequence of your central nervous system. And even if subjective experiences were in fact some sort of non-physical magical pixie dust, when you did die, you would only be left with your subjective experience. But without memories, sensory input, personality, and cognitive functions, what the hell are you going to experience with your immortal subjective experiences? It is impossible to imagine non-existence, because you must exist to imagine something. Your whole argument is a non sequitur, which can be demonstrated with an analogy to artificial intelligence. We can write a very basic computer program with only one subroutine. Is program running? If yes, then x equals 1. If no, then x equals 0. If x equals 1, then prompt message. In order for the program to detect if it is running or not, it has to be running. If in the middle of running the program we cut the power to the computer, the program will immediately stop running, and it won't be able to tell if it is running or not. X will not be equal to 0, because it will be nothing, since the computer is shut off. The same is true for humans. When the sensory input, cognitive functions, memories, and personality is terminated, there is no longer anything to subjectively experience. The program is no longer running. Of course it is impossible to imagine it happening, since the equipment required to determine if the programming, in this case subjective experiences, is running no longer exists, the central nervous system. And even if your absurd argument was logical, which I don't think it is, you still would need to provide some evidence, i.e. empirical evidence. Science have millions of examples of seemingly logical arguments that when empirical tested turned out to be wrong. I can give an example from my master thesis. What we knew was that A had a positive effect on B, which had a positive effect on C. In disease X, the amount of A had diminished, causing C to be lowered. Therefore it was logical to presume that if through medicine we would increase the effect of A, we could return C to a basal normal level. Logical, wouldn't you agree? Was it necessary to even empirical test it? Yes. It turned out that when we increased A, we in fact lowered C even further. That had us perplexed for about 5 minutes until we figured out why. Another week of research revealed our second hunch to be true. A also had an effect on D, which had an inhibitory effect on C. And in disease X, D had been upregulated as well as A being downregulated. Solution: inhibit D, enhance A. Disease cured. No matter how logical an argument is, until you have the empirical evidence to back it up, you have no evidence, because it is impossible to know all the variables before you conduct an experiment. Your argument is not logical, and even if it was, you still haven't proved anything. And I don't expect you to understand this, since you don't understand that there is a difference between philosophy and science, and that philosophers are not scientists. And where is my response video to the video you asked me to do, explaining how you can consider yourself rational while at the same time believe in telekinesis, precognition, and mind reading, among other paranormal activities? You're not rational, you're delusional, and a religious wacky-doodle-doo nutcase. And it is my sincere wish that you would replace Npage85's as the top creationist on YouTube, since while he was insincere, a liar, and had the scientific understanding of a parsnip, you on the other hand is a complete loon, and I am sure as you have watched this entire video, not once have you questioned if you are right or wrong, or if you are sane or not, and that is an obvious sign that you are not. Unfortunately, you will never reach Npage85's numbers of subscriptions, since even the Christians think you are crazy. Since I know you can read minds, until next time.
Until then, this is Peter Beckman saying, see you then. Norman, where do you find these people?